Hey everybody, welcome to Chapter 13, Institutional Management. Right, so what we're going to talk about today is how a prison functions, right? Pretty much the core, the framework of how the prison functions. So, something to focus on, to remember, right? There is no other work site like a prison, right? There is no other place where the employees manage captives. It's part of your job description, right? Prisoners live by the rules of their captives. They live by the rules of the institution. It's not like they are in the free world where you can make a choice whether or not you want to be. You don't like your job, you leave. You don't like school, you leave. You don't like your home, you can leave. But you can't do that in prison. You're sentenced, you have to stay, and you have to follow the rules. And if you don't follow the rules, either you're not going to make it out, or it's going to be a very difficult stay for you. All right? Prisons do not select their clients or control when they enter or exit. That's all decided in the courts, right? And they say, okay, you've been convicted of robbery, and you're going to go in on January 1st, 2021, and you're going to get out. The soonest you're going to get out is July 1st, 2022, but you may be there as long as December 31st, 2028, right? That's the role of the courts. But the actual entry, the actual day you get sentenced, there is a process that's put in place to try to help you understand and become acclimated to this very difficult environment. And when you get out, it's generally speaking up to some board, right? Prison officials must rely on clients who are not paid and maintain functional relationships with these captives, right? In order to keep the place moving, keep the place working properly, right? Imprisonment is meant to be a fair and just confinement of people who have been convicted. But that isn't always the case, because there are hundreds of thousands of people in this country who are in imprisonment or who are in prison awaiting trial, right? They haven't been convicted yet, but they couldn't have money for bail. They didn't have money for bail, or they were not given the option of bail, and they are in essentially to wait until they find out whether or not they are convicted. And in some cases they aren't convicted and they get out, but they've already served 3, 4, 8 months maybe, right? The idea of imprisonment is supposed to be commensurate with the seriousness of the crime. So you commit a really bad crime, your term of imprisonment is longer, right? Usually that's relative to violence, right? How much violence is involved. But sometimes it's the whim of society, so that's the way it is with our drug laws, right? They're starting to change now, but for years, if you were someone who sold drugs on the street illegally, your sentence was harsh if they caught you and could prove the case, right? In New York, we call them the Rockefeller drug laws. But now, 20, 25 years later, we're looking back at those and saying, hey, that might not have been such a great idea. It might be destroying lives, right? So, prison officials must do all of these things. They must keep the prisoners in. They must keep the prisoners safe. They must keep them in line. They must keep them healthy, and they must keep them busy. Now, keeping them busy is a real important part of the rest of it. Because if they're busy, they probably don't have time to hurt each other, right? They probably are more orderly. They probably don't have as much time to hurt each other, so they keep them safe. And it's easier to keep them in if they're distracted, right? The warden is the CEO. All of these are his responsibilities. He is the top prison official, and his attitude and demeanor is going to set the tone for the whole prison. Organizational structure, there's a hierarchy of staff, right? But that's not unusual, right? There's a hierarchy of all staff, of all businesses, right? So in your home, the CEO is probably your mom, right? Could be your dad, but it's probably your mom, could be your grandma, right? But then there are other roles involved, right? If you have aunts and uncles living with you, you probably have some sort of supervisory capacity or custodial capacity over you as a young person, but maybe not as much as your mom or your dad or maybe even your older brother. But there is a structure to that. You have a moment, you should think about that a little bit. This classroom is a structure, right? I'm not the CEO, but I'm the manager of this classroom, and Dr. Pasquarello is probably the COO, and the dean is probably the CEO, right? For what we're trying to do in this classroom, right? And all of these staff people, this hierarchy and staff people, have duties and responsibilities. The duties and responsibilities revolve around 3 functional concepts. The first is unity of command. And unity of command is trying to make sure that we're all on the same page, that we have all the same goals, that the way we all do our different responsibilities are leading to the same responsibilities. And those responsibilities are these: keeping them in, keeping them safe, keeping them in line, keeping them healthy, keeping them busy, right? Add to the bottom of that hopefully giving them a chance to survive in the outside world when they leave. But first and foremost, it's those keeps, right? Chain of command is just like we talked about the hierarchy of staff, right? Warden's at the top. Depending on what line you're in, you have different names for these things, right? Down here we have the staff, right? The custodial staff is generally speaking a uniformed staff. The corrections officers or the guards, depending on where you're working. And what they do is they try to maintain the security and the safety of everybody in the facility, right? It's generally speaking in a kind of a military hierarchy, right? So after the warden you have majors, captains, lieutenants, sergeants, officers, what have you. Different prisons, different states have it a different way, but they're all in that type of military rank structure, right? And that they have a chain of command too. The professional staff that we're talking about, the doctors, the nurses, the teachers, the instructors, the social workers, the therapists. These people, their job, they're professionally trained. Their job is to either to maintain health or help you improve or prepare you for the outside world or to help you manage your time in the institution. And these two professions, these two groups are generally speaking not always on the same page, right? The custodial staff is their number one job is to keep everybody safe and secure, and so they sometimes think that the professional staff, the way they conduct their business, jeopardizes the safety and security of themselves, the officers, and everybody else, right? So there is some conflict there, and then one of the warden's main jobs is to balance that conflict, balance the safety and security with allowing the professionals to do their job to the best of their ability, to help the inmates, the captives, the clients, whatever term you choose to use, help them manage their time to the best of their ability. So maybe they can learn a skill, maybe they'll go into therapy, they'll attend alcohol counseling or drug counseling, learn a trade, learn a skill, maybe they get involved in artwork, something like that, to help their time be as productive and positive as possible, right? And support staff is everybody else. That's the maintenance crew, the cleaning crews, the people that keep the lights on, that keep the place clean, the types of things they support, support the custodial and the professional staff, and of course they support the prisoners, right? Governing prisons there's a couple of theories that I want to talk about here, right? Inmate balance theory, that's the idea that, we talked about this in law enforcement and policing last semester. There are so many rules and regulations out in the street that you can't enforce them all at any one time, right? There are so many rules violations that you can't keep them going and keep them all enforced at one time. So, one of the more popular is, disregarding traffic device stop sign, right? And the colloquial term for that would be rolling through a stop sign. And I think I've spoken about this in the past, if not in this class in law enforcement and policing. You come up to a stop sign, you slow down, but you don't stop, and you kind of roll through it as carefully as possible, but you don't actually come to a full stop. That's a violation of law. Most people who drive have done it. Jaywalking is crossing away from the corners, right, where the crosswalks are. That's jaywalking. That's a minor violation as well. Those are the types of things I'm talking about. It would be impossible to enforce all of these things at any given time. There are 8 million people who live in the city, and there are 30,000 police officers. So to keep up with the 8 million is just impossible. And the same is true in the prisons. That's the idea of inmate balance theory, right? That sometimes you have to let some of these lower infractions go to maintain control, because it's a little bit of freedom that you can give the inmate, right? A little bit of freedom, and if you're a no smoking facility but you're allowed to smoke in a certain area, right? That's the type of thing that might help alleviate some of the tension. Because if you don't alleviate the tension, if there's too much control means too much tension, and anything that has too much tension for too long will break, will snap, right? So if you have a really strong piece of rope and you tie it between two trees and you walk on it every day, and it's never replaced, it's never maintained, somehow if the tension gets too tight, it'll break and somebody will get hurt, right? Administrative control theory is the idea, this is essentially broken windows theory for corrections, right? Breakdowns in control fuel disorder. Disorder leads to a loss of control, kind of a self-fulfilling, a vicious cycle, right? So if you allow minor infractions to happen, they will lead to greater infractions, and then you will lose control. Ultimately, violence happens, people get hurt, sometimes it's the employees, sometimes it's the prisoners. Either way, it's not a good thing. And so you have to keep control of these minor infractions in order to keep control of the facility. Like I said, it's the broken windows theory for corrections, right? The defects of total power theory is kind of interesting, right? Essentially what it says is that the power in a prison does exist, but it's limited, right? It does exist and it's limited. And while the public believes that the power of the facility to control the prisoners is strong, the reality is that the prisoners do not recognize the power of the custodial figures, the guards, the wardens, the corrections officers. They essentially, when they are acting on their best behavior, they're doing so for their own good in their own social structures, and they would do that without the corrections officers, right? All the corrections officers can really do is keep them in, right, and then respond to some serious violent issues, right? Essentially, they're saying that the coercion that is used is an illusion, right? The exercising of power is an illusion. Prisoners do what the prisoners want to do. That's what it says, right? As far as, governing prisons, the way they use discipline in prisons, right? Discipline, the options for discipline are limited. So for decades, for hundreds of years, the way that a prison was maintained was you used brutality, right? So if a prisoner got on the line, they took a beating. And then the Supreme Court kind of put a stop to that, and the outside world kind of said that brutality is not acceptable, and so that they tried to other sanctions, right? So one of the main sanctions was solitary confinement, right? Now, solitary confinement has been criticized by educated correctional leaders for at least 150 years, right? But it's something that you can do without having to brutalize someone. You can put them in a hole, put them in a dark cage, separate them from their associates, and by doing so, you make their time harder. The only problem with that is that there's a lot of medical research that says that putting someone alone in dark places without other human beings damages their psyche and can cause permanent damage, right? So the most international organizations consider solitary confinement or isolation a form of torture, right? So we've gotten away from that in the United States, right? We've gotten away from solitary confinement, right? So, but we've also have the Supreme Court, which has guided most prison reforms since the 60s, right? Up until like in 1990 or so, they put a whole bunch of rulings out there that kind of guided how prisons would function, right? So one of the things is that you can't tell a prisoner they broke a rule if they didn't know the rule existed. So when the prisoner gets in now, they get a rules manual issued to them. Now, the rules manual is not read to them. There's no study session for it. It's issued to them, and it's up to them to read and learn those rules, right? Some of them are considered common sense, but the reality is that some of them are not, and some of them are difficult, right? So it's also important for these inmates to recognize, and these they probably do, infractions may violate criminal law. So you're talking about serious assaults, damaging of property, things like that. That may violate criminal law. Some of the more obscure things, once they outlawed smoking in prison, they may not comprehend that, or they may have difficulty accepting that mentally, emotionally. But infractions may violate law, so they may end up in criminal court again for the things that they do, right? If they don't end up in criminal court, if they're issued a sanction, there is a process for hearings. And it used to be that a prisoner who violated an infraction in the prison would get, added time in their sentence. They get sent to solitary confinement. They'd have privileges taken away. But now, if you dispute that that infraction happened, that sanction is, you don't approve the sanction that's being put upon you, you can have a hearing, right? And the hearings would be in front of either the warden, a small prison board, an ombudsman, somebody who will decide whether or not the infraction actually happened, whether or not you're guilty of the infraction, and whether or not the sanction was fair. All that now happens at the prison level. All right, and that's part 1 of chapter 13. I'm going to get into the role of corrections officers next, but that's a good start.